Colleagues, as Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, it's my pleasure to welcome you to International Solidarity Conference 2021. For the NEU, international solidarity sits right at the heart of our work. It's a cornerstone of trade unionism, bridging differences between people and place as we join in common cause with sisters and brothers around the world in the pursuit of universal human rights, equity and justice. Our conference arrives at a critical moment. Human rights are facing some of the most serious challenges in living memory. The coronavirus pandemic has laid bare existing inequalities and exposed new fractures. 258 million children were out of school before the pandemic even arrived, and now millions more stand never to return. This is the unavoidable context of today's conference, but it is a context and a challenge to which I know our union is rising. Over the last year, despite all the challenges that we have faced, I have been amazed, but I must say not surprised, by your tireless international solidarity. Despite all the pressures we have faced in the UK, we've never lost sight of the fact that the prosperity of our movement is interwoven with the strength of our sister unions around the world. And I am confident that today's conference will only further our resolve and better prepare us to stand with teachers and children around the world as we face the global challenges that lie before us. In the light of the challenges we face, we know that cooperation and collaboration are absolutely vital. And that's why the NEU plays a prominent role in Education International, the global union federation that represents organisations of teachers and education staff. Education International represents more than 32.5 million trade union members from 384 organisations in 178 countries and territories. I am a board member of Education International, and I get to see firsthand the role that EI plays in supporting the realisation of democracy, human rights and peace. So as we open our conference, I am delighted to introduce this message from David Edwards, the General Secretary of Education International and friend of the NEU.
Hello to my friends in NEU. It's an honor to be asked to speak to your International Solidarity Conference. There is no one more important word in our shared vocabulary than solidarity. Education International has always been able to count on the active collaboration of the NEU, and more specifically in the present tense, the constant involvement of Mary Bousted on EI's executive board, who always pays particular attention to issues related to teachers' terms and conditions, human trade union rights, non-discrimination, and equity. And I always know that Kevin is out there fighting and campaigning for social justice with a passion like few others. Together, I think you'll agree they make quite a team. The title of the conference, If Not Now, When, conveys especially well the shared urgency NEU has with our union brothers and sisters around the world. To them and to each one of you, EI serves to advance international solidarity around a progressive, rights-based vision for a sustainable future. The question, if not now, when, is one we ask every day. And we ask it internationally on behalf of NEU and more than 380 member organizations in 178 countries, representing more than 32.5 million educators and education support personnel, from early childhood right up to university. We certainly asked it during our campaign for the UN Sustainable Development Goal 4, ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning for all. Inclusion of an education goal was not easy. It only came after an intense 2-year global campaign by educators and progressive allies across the world. The privatizers wanted affordable education, yet we fought and won for free. But many of you will recall that period as a time when the robot saviors were coming to replace teachers, when screens and faces was the holy grail of education success. It was called a learning crisis because that way you could have a simple solution full of laptops and tablets, emptied of teachers and support personnel, resulting in new revenue for the private sector, direct from the public treasury. But there were a few problems. Governments globally were not meeting their funding commitments to education. And where they did make investments, they too often benefited the privileged at the expense of the most marginalized, effectively widening inequalities. Many countries had failed to adequately invest in teachers' training, resorting to recruiting unqualified teachers on temporary contracts. And worldwide, teachers earned salaries well below the minimum wage, and in too many countries, lacked the fundamental skills, support, and learning materials to teach and teach well. Finally, teaching and learning was too often taking place in unsafe and unhealthy environments, without oversight and often with overcrowded classrooms, scarce materials, and poor sanitary facilities. Fast forward with me now to the weeks before the pandemic struck. 2020. UNESCO had just reported that the world was badly off track to achieve Goal 4. Across the board, the numbers were relentless, the trend consistent. 263 million children and youth were out of school, and the world was on pace to miss Goal 4 target by 88%. The UN also reported almost 69 million teachers needed to be recruited around the world by 2030 if international pledges on education were to be kept. And then came COVID. Almost overnight, the world experienced prolonged school closures and the transitioning of more than 90% of the global student population to off-site emergency education. No education system was fully prepared for this challenge. Millions of teachers adapted to distance practice, the vast majority without the tools, training, or time, but persistently taking the lead to keep education going for millions of students. We were all learning. As the crisis bloomed, we surveyed our member organizations around the world. They reported little to no effort by education systems to coordinate digital technology introduction or assessment with teachers, inadequate training, deep divides between rich and poor, urban and rural. The entire world learned that schools are at the center of our communities. Just ask parents now if they think schools can be replaced by remote learning. Schools are the fundamental driver of students' social and emotional learning and their optimism for the future. Schools are the essential hub of the communities that surround them. But we know that work intensification has hit educators hard. We know from our surveys that work-life balance has been under extreme pressure. And this global phenomenon has been especially well documented in the UK by NEU's own surveys. In the developing world, the story is even more troubling. As COVID shows signs of spiking in Africa, online instruction remains a distant prospect for most students there. Here, in what we call the decade of delivery for the Sustainable Development Goals, there's no question that the pandemic is amplifying inequality. Girls and women, students from disadvantaged backgrounds, migrants and refugees, those vulnerable to child labor are all disproportionately affected by the educational disruption. In fact, for the first time in 2 decades, child labor is on the increase. The pandemic found us where we were, and no matter where we were. And more than education is badly off track. A fellow speaker in this conference, Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, called this a time of grave setbacks in human rights. She said extreme poverty, inequalities, and injustice are rising. Democratic and civic space is being eroded. Navigating a clear way out of the complex COVID-19 crisis and towards an inclusive, green, sustainable, resilient future will be the work of this generation of world leaders. Or it will be their downfall. So, who are those world leaders? Who is really leading? Well, teachers, education workers, and unions for certain. Education unions have been instrumental in helping educators navigate this storm, providing information, support, training, and representation. And in many countries, unions have also helped guide the government's response to the crisis in education. In fact, the evidence shows countries where governments have engaged in constant and meaningful social dialogue with unions have fared far better than in those countries where educators and their unions were not involved. Don't get me started on the consultation process in the UK. Colleagues, this is no surprise to you. Engagement in democracy is in our DNA. Our work is the moral and ethical current of our communities. We are the face of progress and the spine of resistance. And yet we are still in the middle of the COVID fight, and we won't rest. But we are also focused on recovery, on equity, and on the fight for the planet, each of them inseparable in the fight for a sustainable future. This year, the UK is center stage in this fight. The recent G7 meetings was disappointing for its lack of funding commitments against both COVID and climate change. And of course, this was all accompanied by the Johnson government's intention to cut aid contributions that will impact the developing world especially hard. Later in the fall, the UK will host the Global Climate Summit, COP26 in Glasgow. There, EI member organizations from around the world will join you as part of our Teach for the Planet campaign to make climate education a priority globally. Despite the health and educational crisis of the pandemic, it's impossible for us in 2021 to talk about inequity, disruption, and long-term impact on human life without talking about climate change. Climate change education, based on science and with a civic action focus, should be as fundamental as teaching reading and writing. The fight against climate change must have an education face and a teacher's voice in every area of the world. Why a climate change campaign during a pandemic? Well, it's because we have no choice. First, the climate crisis is existential, and the threat is beginning to become so real to the very foundations of our work. We are all in this together, and there will be no recovery or forward momentum unless we build solidarity. Not just the unions or the progressive community, but a global solidarity for a strong public sector that puts people first. And that solidarity needs to flow from a clear commitment to equity. The Global Partnership for Education will be holding its replenishment later this month in London. They're calling for at least $5 billion to help transform education systems in up to 90 lower-income countries and territories. Fully funded, their campaign should enable 175 million girls and boys to learn and enroll a further 88 million more children in school. And while there is still hope that the UK might top up their pledge of £400 million made at the G7 to reach near the £600 million ask, the more important stuff is about making the connections between education financing and tax, debt and austerity. We need to extend debt suspension, supporting country-by-country reporting of corporate tax to make sure developing countries benefit from the recent agreement on a minimum corporate tax rate agreed by G7 finance ministers just a few weeks ago, and stop the imminent return to austerity policies, and especially public sector wage constraints that are imposed by the IMF. Colleagues, there is no stronger force for equity and justice than the world's unions. Our mission, our experience has given us a unique and even historic position here in our own time of great challenge and great peril. We've experienced a rising tide of nativism, unprecedented income inequality, and an unchecked corporate sector and seemingly unstoppable environmental degradation. Our mission, our experience has earned us enemies along the way. We know who they are. Equity and fairness aren't always taken in the night. Rights aren't seized. Sometimes they are ceded to governments and markets because they appear to be somehow irrelevant. The price we pay for progress. Together, we are the enemies of authoritarians who want the future to be less democratic, less politically literate, and more privately owned and controlled. If not us, who? We work in the heart of diverse communities, transmitting shared values against forces that stand to gain if they can redefine our neighbors as instruments of exclusion and division. We stand for truth, and we take collective action in the face of disinformation. We educate, inform, and activate citizens against intolerance. There's only one certain method to oppose authoritarians and build the sustainable future we want. That is to organize, to mobilize, and to build solidarity across states and across nations. If not now, when? Solidarity.
Colleagues, I wish you a brilliant day as you begin International Solidarity Conference 2021. And I want also to wish you all the best for your vital international solidarity work in the coming year. I am immensely proud of everything you do on the global stage. Thank you.